Chapter 5. The First Sunday. Scene 1. Morning of False Hope. The air that morning was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Frost silvered the edges of fences, and each breath clouded briefly before vanishing. Families made their way up the road in careful silence, boots crunching over the hardened ground. After 3 exhausting weeks, the rebuilt church finally stood modest but proud at the rise, its pale timber bright against the darker fields beyond. The wood still smelled of sap and fresh varnish. The bell rope had been restrung. Thomas pulled it with both hands, his narrow face set in solemn concentration. The iron bell rang uncertainly at first, then steadier, the sound carrying thin but hopeful across the settlement. People had dressed for the occasion, coats brushed free of soot, buttons polished. Women carried the hymnals against their chests as though cradling something fragile. Even the children seemed to sense the weight of the morning and moved with unusual restraint. They needed this to work. Elias stood at the entrance, gloved hands loosely clasped, greeting each person by name as they passed. Mrs. Mercer, Brother Hayes, Hannah. Their eyes met his with something deeper than gratitude, hope strained thin by desperation. The elder clasped Elias's shoulder with a grip that lingered a little too long, as though testing whether the man himself was steady. "We begin again," the elder said. "Yes," Elias replied. For the first time since the grave had closed over his wife and child, something inside him stirred that was not merely duty, purpose. The sanctuary filled quickly. Sunlight poured through the new windows and caught along the fresh beams, turning them briefly honey gold. The altar cloth Widow Mercer had sewn lay smooth and white at the front. Above it hung the small cross carved by the children, slightly crooked but earnest. Mr. Hale, the skeptic, sat in the back pew with arms folded and expression set. Everyone had come. No one wanted to miss what might happen. Elias stepped to the pulpit. For one fragile moment, he almost believed he could be useful again. Scene 2. The sermon interrupted. The hymnals rose without accompaniment, voices uneven but determined. There was trembling in the singing, but also something else beneath it. Earnestness. Elias opened the Bible. He spoke not of judgment or fire, but of endurance. "Job cried out into silence," he said, "and though heaven did not answer as he wished, he remained faithful." As he continued, his voice steadied. "Faith is not the absence of ash, it is persistence within it. We rebuild not because we are certain, but because we hope." Heads nodded. Several people wept quietly. He spoke of light surviving ruin, of foundations that outlast flame, of a God who does not depart merely because walls fall. And for a suspended, fragile moment, it felt like church again. Then the doors swung open. They struck the interior wall with a crack that split the room. Every head turned. A figure stood framed in the daylight, still, cloaked. No one moved. Her footsteps down the aisle were unhurried and measured. The air thickened as she advanced. Several candles along the wall guttered sharply, their flames thinning as though the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. Elias tried to speak. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth. The figure reached the front of the sanctuary and slipped the cloak from her shoulders. The sound that moved through the congregation was not a single gasp, but many small fractures of breath, breaking at once. She stood before them. Her form was unmistakably female and unmistakably not human. Strange tattooed patterns curled across her arms and hips, intricate and deliberate, like a language written directly into flesh. Her eyes burned a steady crimson. Horns curved cleanly from her temples, framing the ornate headpiece resting between them. Dark, bat-like wings folded behind her back like heavy silk. She was not grotesque. She was magnificent, and deeply, profoundly wrong. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." She smiled faintly as though the words amused her. Elias felt the same warmth from the dreams rise suddenly through his chest. It was her. Panic did not come at once. It arrived slowly, as though the mind required permission to fracture. A woman screamed. A child began to cry. The she-devil stepped lightly onto the platform. No resistance met her bare feet. She placed one hand upon the pulpit where Elias's Bible lay open. "Persistence," she said softly, glancing at the page. Her voice filled the room without effort. You call it faith when heaven does not answer. She lifted the Bible gently, turning it in her hands as one might examine a relic. You rebuild the same walls and call it hope. You suffer and call it sacred, she said, but the grave does not sort the faithful from the faithless. It only closes. A murmur rippled through the congregation. The hymnals trembled in the pews. One slid loose and struck the floor, then another. You are hungry, she said, her gaze moving slowly across the room. Hungry for certainty. Hungry for proof that your suffering purchases meaning. She turned, deliberately letting her gaze rest on individuals, on Anna, on Daniel, on Mr. Hale. You pretend restraint, she said softly, but you ache. The cross flared briefly brighter, then dimmed, leaving a darkened outline in the grain. The scent of smoke threaded into the air. You do not want a distant God, she said. You want an answer that breathes. I am that answer. Silence followed, heavy, listening. There are but two undeniable experiences in this existence, suffering and pleasure. No one challenged her. She knelt upon the pulpit as though it were an altar fashioned for her alone, one hand braced behind her, spine arched in deliberate exhibition. If pain is random, then pleasure is the only rebellion left. Her free hand drifted lower, unhurried, fingers trailing over her abdomen. Her hips shifted forward as her hand traveled downward and settled between her thighs. The congregation did not move. Breathing thickened throughout the room. A man in the second row swallowed hard. A woman lowered her eyes, then raised them up again. Elias felt heat rise in his chest before he fully understood its source. Between her hips, the demon woman's middle finger began a slow circling motion. Behold, she whispered, voice still steady, though her body had begun to answer its own motion. The pleasure you have denied yourselves in the name of unseen masters. The sound that escaped her was soft, intimate, uncontrolled. Several parishioners turned away. None left. Elias felt his pulse begin to match the rhythm before he could stop it. Shame flooded him, hot beneath his collar. A sharp cry tore from her as the movement crested and broke through her in a visible shudder of ecstasy that seemed to ripple outward into the air itself. Those in the front row flinched as warm droplets struck skin and fabric. A young man stared, blood drained from his face. A woman pressed her thighs together hurriedly, her cheeks flushing. The she-devil brought her hand slowly to her mouth and tasted her middle finger, her breasts heaving as her breathing slowly returned to normal. Liquid cascaded down her inner thighs. Then she laughed softly, with a satisfied grin. You cannot deny what I feel in you, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. You rise and vanish like breath in winter. Why cling to rules that promise meaning and deliver only silence? Her eyes hardened slightly. The crosses and hymnals along the wall glowed dull red and began to smoke. Now the panic came in earnest. People fled in disarray, weeping, stumbling, dragging children behind them. Some did not look back, others could not stop themselves. Within moments, the sanctuary stood nearly empty, except for Elias. He had not moved. His hand still gripped the pulpit. She turned toward him. The space between them felt impossibly narrow. You called louder than you knew, she said. His throat decided to work. Hellspawn, he managed hoarsely. I rebuke you in the name of... The name would not come. She approached him slowly. You asked why heaven was silent. You mistook silence for absence. Her finger lifted and traced lightly down the front of his coat, stopping over the violent hammer of his heart. The touch was intimate. Your body has already answered me, she murmured. Heat surged through him, shamefully familiar. You rebuild for them, she said softly, glancing toward the empty pews. But you are the one collapsing. I will return for you. Not a threat, a promise. Then she stepped back, the air shifted, and she was gone. The sanctuary stood in stunned silence. Dust drifted peacefully through the sunlight. Elias remained where he was. Slowly he turned. On the pulpit beside the open Bible, a darkened mark marred the fresh wood. The burn curved in deliberate lines, almost script. A sigil etched by heat. Outside, the sound of the town scattering carried faintly through the open air. Inside, the silence pressed close. And that night, more than one of them dreamed of wings.